Hey everyone, welcome to Lecture 5 of the Code Sprint program series. I'm Sam Sandoval, your Technical Project Manager, and today we'll be focusing on testing and deployment. So let's get started. Like always, here are some of the resources that we provide with the slides if you want to come back to review these later, because we know some of you are probably watching this when it's not streamed, as well as if you want to find more information about where the starter code is or any other questions or resources, check out our GitHub repo in the links below. All right. So today we'll be just going through a rough overview of what we're doing. We have the testing, which is what we focus on in the beginning. Then we'll go into the deployment, why and how to deploy your EXPO applications. And then lastly, we'll conclude the live demo by me with certain deployment issues and testing. So yeah, let's get started. So when we use the word testing, we're generally referring to automated testing because there's that, and then there's manually testing, which manually testing doesn't normally work well with applications that really grow in size, because the more complex you make your application, the harder it becomes to keep up with the manually testing. So like, for instance, if you're working on a big project and you're adding 10 features a week that grows linearly, and it could just be a lot harder to keep up with the manually testing. But that's why I think adding things like a test suite can really help you catch bugs before you ship, because testing is really important, especially with products that you want to give users, because you want to make sure that bugs aren't shipped out, because a broken app could just leave bad reviews and really make things a problem. So that's why testing is important. But you might be thinking, so how do we make sure we know what in the app to test and like what parts to test? And that's where this structure comes along, the test pyramid. It determines the methodology for determining the test scale. So at the very bottom of the pyramid, we have something called like a unit test. And this tests an individual unit of code. And generally that's either like a class, a method, or a function. And then you have an integration or service test, which allows you to test the integration of multiple pieces of code and how they work. And this is how completely independent of the UI. Which brings us to our last type of test, which is the UI test, or end-to-end. And this allows us to test a feature thoroughly, including the UI and network calls and everything. So basically, from one end of your code all the way to the other, basically what a user would be doing themselves. So it's all around like what specifically to test and through the different types of tests that exist. So I mentioned unit tests earlier, and you're probably thinking, how are we going to write some basic unit tests? As we talked about in the last slide, testing is basically testing an individual unit of code, just like a function, class, or method. And one great thing about unit tests is they're very granular. So you know where exactly your code is breaking. And that makes it very easy to tell like what you need to fix exactly. And the most basic unit test is just like a function that lets you know like what behavior is expected or whether not expected. So there are also alternatives to unit tests, such as testing frameworks. And they give you additional benefits. One benefit of them is that they run all your tests instead of failing on the first behavior, which it's great because it gives you a pretty good output, because it shows you like, oh, like these tests all pass and then this one failed. Like instead of just saying, oh, the first one failed, no more, it goes through all of them and can show you like, oh, which failed and all that. It also has a cool benefit to automatically watch for any specific changes in the application. So as if we change our logic, the test can automatically run without remembering to run and check them before with that. And lastly, they give us these things called mock functions, which are pretty impressive and great and really mock some of the actions in your mobile application. So now let's go ahead and go into a little demo in what writing a unit test could look like in JavaScript. And I'm just going to show you how to do that in something simple. So here we have a simple JavaScript file. We're going to be making a simple summing function. And this function is just going to take two inputs in that are integers, and they're just going to add them. Yeah, so it's going to return that. And we're going to make some simple console.asserts, which will be like our unit test in this situation, to test out like, oh, what is the certain behavior. So like the first test we're having here is when the sum has passed in 1 and 1, which obviously the sum of that would be 2. So, and if it's not, it'll give you like an assert fail, this happens. So like after we run the node command to test out, and when you run it and there's no output, that means, hey, this passed. So we're making another test here to test out 0 and 0. And the whole goal is to show you how to, like, what the different tests work, showing you like these good ones that are passing. And yeah, so the reason I have two like little, I guess, outputs, I have like one that's like, here's the expected behavior, and then here's what you say when there's an error. The right side is that. So yeah, testing it right now. They both pass. Nice. Okay. So yeah, so we're gonna, I think we're gonna add one failing one. Yeah, so when I do 1 and 1 is 3, it fails, and you can see that here in the code. So yeah, it's pretty much a little that in a nutshell. So a great testing framework to use when you're developing apps in React Native is Jest. And it's something that people call like a delightful JavaScript testing, which is a pretty bold claim. So we'll see that it's pretty cool to work with. So this is a test framework that was written by some engineers at Facebook. So it's the same people who wrote React Native. And the way that you really would want to install it is going to be npm install --save -dev. And you can do that here, like as you can see the command. And so yeah, and then the way you run that would be npx jest. And there's a lot of more you can look onto that. We'll put a link in the description on how to use jest. Definitely would suggest using that when you're testing out some of your basic React Native applications. So let's look at ways to set up integration tests. So one way you might get to do that is using just snapshot testing in the components, which is pretty great for testing your certain behaviors. And we can also use the snapshot feature to test the output of a component when rendering, which is definitely great. When it comes to doing render outside of the context of our application, React allows us to do that with something called React Test Render, which is maintained by the React team. And it's pretty great. And it just pretty much allows us to render our components outside of the context of our application. And so we have some docs here you could definitely look up and see like how can we be using the test render here with testing out the components outside. And another thing that's great is that the EXPO team figured out something with configured just a little bit more to work better with React, which is kind of what I mentioned earlier. So you should definitely check that out. There's the link right there. One good practice when it comes to writing tests and writing your code is called test-driven development, where it's pretty much your test is driving the code that you're trying to implement, which is great. And as long as you know what you want to be implementing, you can write the test first and then implement your components or whatever you're trying to implement that fulfills these tests. And it's pretty great technique. I've done it myself, and it's definitely one that can really help you speed the development as well as write clean code. And so tests are pretty much less tests and more on the specification of what should be happening. In other words, it's pretty much saying what should this function or component be doing, and it really just does help. Now we're going to shift gears and kind of focus on deployment and how to handle that with your React Native application. When deploying your application, you want to make sure you deploy to the right app store, and one way to do that is by building the app and uploading it to the app store. Before you got to do that, you got to make sure you have the correct metadata set up in your app.json file, and you can make sure you know what those are exactly with the EXPO documentation, which is a link here, and then you go about building your app in the command line. And then after you set up using XP, it's basically an alternative to XD because XD doesn't allow us to build an app with the GUI. And yeah, there's just a little bit more information on how to build up your application when it comes to building it locally. And then you could either build it up to be certain like with iOS or Android. And it builds with the EXPO bundle as well as it can upload it to S3, which is great. And the way you might build onto your computer is when you run an XP build status, which shows you like it runs while it's building. And then it pretty much lets you know when it's done, spits a URL with linking it. So yeah, we'll have some links and resources and ways to build your app. Then you can upload it to your appropriate store depending on if it's iOS or Android. And there's more documentation links, like I mentioned earlier, to check that out. And yeah, one great thing you can do with EXPO is deploy a new JavaScript by republishing. And that's what it's called over-the-air update, which is definitely great because you can upload the new bundle to make sure that your app is working. And yeah, you can also go ahead and download some of the new JavaScript from the web and run it on your application. And yeah, and this is all great and pointing out to some of the ways you can republish your applications with JS in general. So another way to export your applications and build it off to separate them with their respective developments is called EXPO eject. And this pretty much will eject the project from EXPO into like an Android and an iOS build so that you can work on them separately or upload them separately into your respective app stores. I can show a little demo on this later, but yeah, that's another way to do it. And yeah. All right, now we're going to shift gears and just do a quick live demo on how to eject. And yeah, I'm going to take it away from there. Hey everyone, welcome to the Lecture 5 demo. For this demo, I'll be showing you how to export your EXPO projects. So if you'd like to follow along, you can feel free to download the starter code from the GitHub repository. If not, you can just watch. This will be very brief. And yeah, so after you make sure you have all the node modules and EXPO installed inside your projects, you can run the simple EXPO eject command, and then it'll prompt you like if you want to do this. And I'm going to be like, yeah, we're going to do this. And then you could rename like whatever you want. So I'm just going to hit enter because it just calls it whatever. Also hit enter there. And then it handles the bundling and installing all the dependencies and all that. So it takes a brief moment to get all that configured. But yeah, I'll show you guys what the end result is in just a few moments. So yeah, after a while, the EXPO will eject, and it will eject two bundles here. We have like the iOS, and then we have Android, you'll see that they're both bundled out with like their different projects. Yeah, with just like access them. So yeah, so I hope you learned a lot from this demo. I look forward to seeing some of your guys' projects that you guys are developing in the project program. And yeah, thank you for watching this.